welcome everyone, and welcome especially to Ramses Nosshi, who's going to talk to us about his work today. And today's session is about thinking about environmentally appropriate and environmentally sensitive architecture. And Ramses is going to talk to us about two of his projects, one in a desert context and another in an urban context in Egypt, as a reflection of that. But I thought that it would be very useful to give some kind of historical context to Egypt and ideas of modernity. And given that our whole course is about modernity, I would start with a 10-minute introduction looking at taking us back maybe around 80 years and paving the way to Ramses's presentation. Okay, so one common theme to all our talks is that we're looking at examples and people that have thought against the current in some ways and been innovative and challenged the status quo. And so that's why I entitled my introduction A Different Sort of Modernity. Ramses is a very good example of a different sort of modernity because he looks at aspects of design like passive solar architecture and other things that many people ignore today. And I said I'd take you back 80 years. And so I'm going to start with this image of a very famous building in Cairo, the Immobilia building, which construction started in 1938 in the center of Cairo. It was celebrated and still is as an important example of modern architecture. Many movie stars lived in the building. It was considered to be a very stylish and significant place to live. In many ways, it was modeled on European ideas of and American ideas of the skyscrapers, of living in apartment buildings. It had an underground car park. And so if we think of Egypt 80 years ago, this is a very good emblem of the modernist idiom and how people thought modern life could and should look like. So just remember the year 1938. Here's another example of a building a year later, 1939, the Villa of Egypt and the Middle East, one of the Middle East's most celebrated performers, Kulthum, a great singer, built by an Egyptian architect, Ali Labib Gabr, and also capturing the international ideas of modernity with its curved balconies and made possible by the use of reinforced concrete and also modern building materials, which were very popular. And so this is another of the sorts of images that were shaping and fueling and inspiring Egyptians of the time. And this is, one thing to think about is that if you study architecture, you generally are expected to produce work that emulates and fits in within a mold of what is seen as the appropriate architecture of the period. This villa in Giza, close to the pyramids, was designed by an architect that we're going to hear a bit about in a few minutes, Hassan Fathi, who is known for a very different type of architecture. But generally, it takes something of a revolutionary spirit, even if you revolt in your own quiet way, to produce architecture that's different from what is expected of you. In this case, Hassan Fathi, one of the two examples I'm going to talk about before we move to Ramses Nosshi, did rebel against the type of architecture that he was encouraged to design as a young architecture student. And the idea of modernity and the idea of buildings like the Immobilia building I showed you is also related to quick modes of transport, mass transport. This whole idea of society is changing, and in some ways, turning back on the past and embracing technology and not looking back. And it was something. Egypt is the example that we're looking at today, but I don't think it wasn't limited to Egypt. It was something happening all around the world, and in the developing world, I would say, there was a clear impetus and energy that, we should do what Western Europe and America is doing. And one of the things to think about is, how did ideas spread? In countries like Egypt, the booming movie industry was one of the strongest ways in which design ideas spread. And there are many examples of film. If you watch Egyptian movies from the period, they often capture the idea of this change from tradition to modernity and through design. So you see examples of old-fashioned people. There's a very famous film actually featuring the lady on the left, Layla Murad, and Yusuf Wahbi, who's the man to her left in a sort of dressing gown. And she's his younger cousin. She goes to stay with him and she tells him, "Oh, you're very old-fashioned. You need to change the way you live." And she says, "Okay." He says, "Okay, I'll give you a sum of money. Go and do what you want." And she transforms the house from this old-fashioned house with heavy curtains and gilt furniture into a very modernist Art Deco house. And suddenly he has parties and everyone says, "Oh, he's very nice and charming." And so these are the ideas that hundreds of thousands of Egyptians were listening to and watching. And often when you look at old movies, you find that they tell you who produced the furniture, for example, so that in a way, they have a very strong influence on taste and style. And in case you ever wonder how do design ideas spread, at this time in the 40s and 50s, the cinema was a very good way of spreading ideas. So now we'll turn to the two protagonists of our introduction, Ramses Nosshi, who's Ramses Nosshi's grandfather, and Hassan Fathi, who were both, they met in 1938, the year that the Immobilia building started its construction. Ramses had studied in France. They both studied architecture, Ramses in France, and both of them independently and then together were very perturbed by what was happening in countries like Egypt at the neglect of architectural tradition, of local traditions, of thinking about local materials, the local environment, and both pursued the path that was very different from the path of the construction of buildings like Immobilia, which I showed you. In 1935, Ramses, in his graduation project in Paris, designed a building for potters in Old Cairo. He was very enamored by the old parts of the city where he saw tradition and an environmentally responsive architecture that responded to people. And even as a student, in his project, he was keen to embody principles that he thought were important. Hassan Fathi and Ramses Nosshi both met as lecturers with teaching architecture. They both went on a trip to the south of Egypt in 1941 to an area known as Nubia, and was struck by the traditional techniques of building using local materials. And both pursued a path of championing an architecture that was very different from that of Immobilia and was much more drawn from its local context, from history, and from the ideas of Egyptian identity and the continuity of tradition. And so I think it's very appropriate, Ramses, that you're here today, because I feel that it's nice to actually see someone who's grown up in an environment and inherited across at least two generations this idea of the locally appropriate and the thoughtful and the sensitive. So this is the school. This is the house of the potter's house in Old Cairo that Ramses Nosshi designed in 1935 as part of his graduation project. 6 years later, he actually designed a building in Old Cairo, which a pottery workshop. And so from an early age, as I mentioned, and then early in his career, he was committed to the idea of thinking of alternative solutions that were much more drawn from their context. Hassan Fathi battled quite hard, to try and convince government authorities to build using traditional techniques that him and Ramses and others had seen on their trip to Nubia. And this is the example of the village of Gurna near Luxor, where it was, the old village had sprung up around on the site of historic tombs, and the government was very disturbed by the fact that many of the houses were actually built on the tombs, and some of the villagers were making a living selling things, digging and finding tombs and selling things from the tombs. So they decided that they were going to relocate the village. And through many battles and struggles, Hassan Fathi decided or managed to convince the government that rather than build using modern material, the iron and reinforced concrete and the materials that were very typical at the time, like the ones that built the Immobilia building, that they should use the traditional techniques and building materials of the south of Egypt to build a replacement village for these villages that were going to be relocated. And this village, of which some remains today, is called New Gorna. It's not very far away from the old one. There was a lot of resistance, I mean, not just from the government, but also from the villagers themselves, I mean, who obviously resented being relocated, but even in the context of people living in mud brick houses, like the old village of Gorna, there was an idea that actually these modern techniques of building and modern and sky rises or things that look like sky rises were actually the way to go. And there was resentment on part of the villagers as well about the type of alternative that they were being offered in Hassan Fathi's New Gorna. I mean, Hassan Fathi persisted with the ideas of appropriate building and respecting traditional materials and thinking about the environment and energy, and faced a lot of resistance throughout his whole career. In fact, many of his patrons were wealthy, well-educated Egyptians who had traveled and who were more aware of these bigger questions of the environment and what's happening to the world. And although much of his initial interest was in thinking of low-cost solutions to house the poorer echelons of Egyptian society, many of his patrons during his lifetime were wealthier Egyptian. And here are some examples of the type of architecture drawn from local tradition using mud bricks, adobe, and so very, very low cost and very readily available materials. And this is the theater in New Gorna, which Hassan Fathi envisaged as a place where the community would come together. It's interesting to go to Gorna today because New Gorna today, people still live in it, but many of the ideas of Hassan Fathi's design did not really come to fruition due to the difference of perspective between his ideas and what people actually thought they wanted to move to. Given that this sequence of sessions is related to the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, I should mention that both Hassan Fathi and Ramses Nosshi were early recipients of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Hassan Fathi in 1980, as a champion of indigenous building, proving that actually these brick structures were both economical to build and admirably suited to the climate. And these were things that most people at the time weren't really thinking of. We moved to Cairo now, or to the outskirts of Cairo, to a very special place, Haraneya, a village where Ramses Nosshi bought land in the 1950s and constructed an art center, capturing two related things. One of them, these principles of how do we build appropriately, and I'm sure Ramses Nosshi will add to this in his presentation and discussion. But also, Ramses Nosshi was also very interested and keen to explore the creative elements that the children had, and he believed that innately children had the creativity and that the traditional school system suppressed it. And rather than bring out the creativity in children, it forced them to think of other things. And he encouraged young children from the village of Haraneya to weave. He taught them to weave and to capture the world around them through weaving tapestries, which I don't know if any of you have made tapestries, but it's a slow and thought-provoking process where, in his case, the children didn't draw anything beforehand. It was all absorbing their environment and expressing gradually what they saw around them. And Haraneya today, now run by Ramses Nosshi's parents, Ikram Nosshi and Suzanne Nossi, and also Joanna Nossi, still embodies these pioneering ideas of Ramses Nosshi and his wife, Sophie, who saw and who sought and who presented alternatives to the type of urban change that was happening in Egypt. A much more thoughtful and comfortable with the environment way of living. And in 1983, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture recognized the Ramses Nosshi Art Center in Haranaya as an exemplar of architecture that responded to so many significant things. And I think the jury's statement, its commendation of saying the beauty of its execution, the high value of its objectives, the social impact of its activities, as well as the power of its power as an example, and its role as a center for art and life, and its endurance, its continuity, and its promise. One could talk for hours and hours about the Ramses Nosshi Art Center, but I felt that it would be valuable to place Ramses Nosshi's current practice in the context of alternatives to the modernity that they presented, and especially, I mean, in his case, since his grandfather was so pioneering in developing an amazing model of not just architecture, but also craft and community, that it would be unacceptable not to present it and to use it as a way of introducing Ramses. But I just want to show you a couple of images of the buildings built by Ramses Nosshi, Ikram Nosshi, his son-in-law, and some by yourself, right, Ramses?
Yes, there was a restoration of this building because it had been damaged by groundwater and parts of it collapsed. So we rebuilt parts of it and sort of restored the rest in 2009, I think.
Okay. And this is, in this lovely photo, is the dyeing of wool that's used to make the tapestries that have made Haranaya and the Ramses Nosshi Art Center internationally renowned. And I mean, one of the most amazing things about it is how really connected to the land it is, including the fact that the plants that produce the dyes are planted on site, or some of them are planted on site. The dyeing happens on site. So it's really, I mean, very unusual in today's world to find a place that really is so connected to the land, and where people, buildings, and art are all integrated. And this is one of the weavers partway through making one of the tapestries inspired by the nature around her. Here are two tapestries that have been completed. And here is a beautiful portrait of an Egyptian village prior to many of the urban changes that we see in Egypt today. And if you want to find out more about the Ramses Nosshi, actually the architecture of Ramses Nosshi, I recommend this book, which I didn't have in the original reading list, but it's a very good source to go to. So with that, I will introduce Ramses Nosshi. Thank you, Ramses, for being here. One of the things that I think is very interesting about your practice is that while it embodies the same spirit of the kind of questions that your grandfather was thinking about, the context in which you work is different, and therefore the forms are sometimes different. And I think that that's important, that sometimes when we think about, I mean, sometimes people don't realize that the quest of environmentally sensitive architecture is not only in how buildings look like, but that they should function and that they should respond to their context really sensitively and really cleverly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Ramses, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Saif, for a thorough and complicated introduction. But you do point out a lot of very important points regarding how the two pioneers, Ramses Nosshi and Hassan Fathi, and I'm sure many others, had to face through their work how to be relevant and how to be relevant in terms of being useful as an architect, of introducing ideas and being critical of what came before and what was happening at the time. So they sort of resisted following the mainstream in modern design, and sort of tried to bring back the relevant ideas from traditional architecture in terms of their environmental performance, their ecological impact, and also their cultural relevance. So a lot of the resistance that they met was due to the fact that a lot of the buildings and the ideas they were reintroducing seemed to be going in the opposite direction of modernity, until they started picking up, and until their merit was felt through different projects. And I think that since then, in Egypt in particular, there's been sort of a pendulum swing. It kind of had the opposite effect now, that at the time when they introduced these ideas, they weren't going for a stylistic or an aesthetic approach to design. It was more functional, and it became sort of reduced nowadays to being a style. So when anyone talks about environmental architecture in Egypt, automatically they will assume domes and mud brick, which is sort of a reduction of the idea, but it was very relevant at the time because it enabled unskilled laborers, unskilled masons to build cheaply and appropriately for the hot climate. And now we sort of have to resist using the same language by remaining honest to the questions at hand, which were just as relevant as they were back then, which are the scarcity of resources, the cultural context, the natural context, the economic context. And by remaining, honest and critical of these issues, one can then try to build something relevant. That's sort of the tie or the underlying thread that I'd like to keep throughout this presentation, with sort of being critical about environmental architecture. I will show you today two projects, very different projects. One is in a pristine natural setting, the desert along the red coast of Egypt in the south, an area called Marsa Alam, which was designated as a national park for the first time when we started this project. And the other one is in an urban setting in Cairo, in an unplanned neighborhood. So I will start sharing my screen now and walk you through the projects. Can you see it, Saif? Can you?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is basically sort of a collage of the plan of the building, and on the right-hand side you can see the Red Sea coast, and I don't know if can you see the pointer?
Yes.
This area there, this is the area that we're talking about. The shaded area is the national park of Wadi Gemal. So in 2008, this area was declared as a national park because of its unique desert and coast. It's home to two main tribes, the Ababda and the Bashaira. Both live between Egypt and Sudan. The Ababda are mostly nomads. They're fishermen and herdsmen, and the Bashaira are more They're also herders as well, but they're more warriors, and they travel back and forth between Egypt and Sudan, and even at a very young age, they're young men at age 12 can walk alone between the two countries, and they have the right to go through the borders. So this area was also a very famous caravan route for a lot of the trades that goes between Egypt and the rest of the world through the Red Sea, mostly the Arab Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, and north and south from there, as well as several mining towns, gold mines, precious stones along that route. So these are some images of the Ababda, their traditional clothes and the context that they inhabit. So basically, the area, it's the Red Sea Mountains, and it's noted for the valleys, and these tribes, they know the valleys like the back of their hands, basically, through landmarks. In this case, this acacia tree. So this is one of the main demarcations of the valley that helps them find their way. And in this case, you can see a very young boy, probably a teenager, like 16 or something, with a camel in the middle of the desert, miles and miles from any other settlement. And the relevance of the trees are they get a lot of the fuel for cooking from dead branches. There's the seeds from the trees that they use for food, and shade during the hot parts of the day. So the trees are very relevant and very important, and they play a significant role in their lives, as well as the camel trade. This is the coast. So during summer, they're fishing along the coast, and during the winter, they're herding their camels and goats in the valleys. This is the trade route currently. You can see a truck with camels coming from Sudan to Egypt. And this is the traditional shelter that's built out of random branches, basically, just placed carefully together like a nest. It's called the birsh, and it basically provides shade and filters the air, and becomes a gathering space. This is it from the outside. This is another form of birsh. It's built out of woven mats. A lot of them come from Sudan, but it gives basically the same spatial feeling, the same lighting as the previous one. And this is the woven mats themselves. The other material that's used is rubble, stone, basically collected and built. It's a dry form of construction that doesn't require mortar. It's found in many of the ruins in the area, Greco-Roman and Egyptian ruins. This is the way it looks when it's built. Basically, it's large blocks of stone stacked and skillfully wedged with chips of stone that keeps the wall stable. This is another form of shelter that they build out of found objects. Basically, in this case, it's found wooden objects, driftwood, pallets, sheets of particle board. This is another form that's out of metal. These are basically oil drums that have been flattened and the tops cut, used as a shelter. This is another found object off of a boat, probably a buoy. So our role in this project was to build a visitor center that becomes sort of an introduction for people to this area. that introduces them to the natural environment as well as the culture of the Ababda and the Bashaira. Before the project, this was the building they were using to play that role. And so we had to build something else that's more appropriate and sort of more welcoming and more interesting for visitors. These are the displays that they had showing corals and flora and fauna of the area. So this is the site that was chosen up on this plateau over the highway and overlooking the Red Sea. The site had an acacia tree similar to the one I showed in the earlier slides, and but much younger. So this was sort of one of the landmarks of the site. This is a plan showing the coastal highway and the site of the building. So when thinking about this building, we wanted to introduce a form of architecture that was relevant and contemporary in terms of the function, because the function is not a traditional one. Nobody from these tribes will ever build a visitor center. They will build a house. So in this case, we were building a new type of building, and we had to be critical of the ideas and the materials that we chose. So the goal was to use the materials and the techniques that were already being used, and sort of to bring a professional level of ideas to how they can be put together in a better way. So this is basically just a diagram showing the circulation and the function of the building. Basically, people would be approaching from the entrance there, and then there will be 4 different galleries. One about the geology of the space of the area, another one about the culture, the different tribes living in the area, a third one for the flora and fauna, and the last one was about the marine life. And then you come out onto the terrace and you can view the Red Sea and the desert around. So the building was to serve sort of as a beacon or a landmark for the area. So we tried to think about it the same way as the tree, for example, in the valley that I showed earlier, where you provide a lot of shade, you provide a lot of the sort of a modified microenvironment that's more gentle and easier to be in than the harsh desert. So we decided to build a roof basically that provided the shade, and all the other functions and spaces were underneath that roof. We had a double roof that allows the air to flow through between the top one was a metal roof, sort of like the oil drums that I showed earlier, and the lower one is the stone walls of the ruins that I showed you in the previous slide. This is a view from above. There's an opening in the roof that sort of allows the air to flow through and keeps the sense of being outside in the building. Those are some the technical drawings of the elevations of the building and the stone rubble walls. We set up camp on site. Basically, we were there for about 8 months, quarrying the stone, collecting the wood for the screens and the rest of the materials that were needed. So it was a choice between natural materials that are readily found in the area, and anything that was going to be shipped in from elsewhere had to be reusable, basically. So just like they were recycling their own found materials and wood and steel, we wanted to do the same with the materials of the building. So even after the building has lived out its life, the materials can be reused. So this is an image of the stone being collected, gathered from the site, not far from there, and then being laid on site. So these are the foundations. And that's the actual construction process. You can see there's very little mortar being used. The stone is stacked with these small shims in between. This is basically the stone being dressed, shaped to size, and laid in the walls. And then these are some images of the actual building. Throughout the process of construction, a very interesting thing happened was with the masons that I worked with there. Basically, usually they would build the stone walls, and then that's the end of their role in the building. However, because it's a complicated building in terms of having different materials, and there's not much skilled labor in the area, we were able to train them to become to work with the wood and to work with the steel. So we were lucky to be able to work with the same crew from start to finish. We had some specialized craftsmen and technicians for the electrical and the plumbing, of course, but overall the same crew that did the construction, did the roofing, and did all the rest of the work. Here we're setting the brackets for the steel brackets for the wooden roof, the wood structure of the roof. And that's the wood shop that we set on site, we built on site. The building is quite simple. You can, it's sort of a meccano where you can look at it and you can see how it's put together. Everything is bolted together. Everything is quite rough, and also it can be taken apart and reused if it's no longer functional. We used the same. We used palm panels for the roofing of the secondary roof underneath the metal roof, basically to give the same lighting as you saw in the earlier images of the birsh, the traditional house of Da'babda. Here you can see the two layers of the roof. One is metal, and the second is the palm midribs, basically like reeds that allow light and air to pass through, and it's still protected and shaded by the metal roof above. Here you can see the same masons who laid the stone walls are putting together the roof and tensioning the cables, and it was a learning experience for all. When we finished, there was a fear of the stone walls being sort of a very inviting home for scorpions and snakes and other desert creatures. So we got some clay from the floodplains of the valley, and we filled in the walls basically and brushed off. You can see the handprints in the stone in the mud. And then it was cleaned off. I got some visitors. And this is an image of the building from a distance. So basically, you can see how the roof lines follow a similar geometry of the acacia trees, and they play the same function of providing shade and letting air through. Another image of the building. This is the entrance side. The windows were protected with very rough wooden branches to break the light. And this is the terrace overlooking the sea. And here's the acacia tree after we were finished. These are some images from inside the building. Unfortunately, the displays weren't finished at the time of these pictures were taken, so I have just a few of those. But you can get a sense of the quality of light and the inside of the building. I think this building is a decent example of sort of a contemporary structure, contemporary language of the geometry of it, the function of it, and everything, but at the same time using very contextual elements, the natural materials, the simple technology of the construction itself. So this is this is a very different project. As I said, it's sort of an extreme contrast. This is another project that we did in Cairo. It's in Stabla Antar, which is on the plateau, on the eastern plateau overlooking Cairo, on the east bank of the Nile. It's an unplanned neighborhood where a lot of the garbage is collected and sorted and recycled. So the inhabitants of the area, they have very, very little facilities. The government provides very little for these neighborhoods. So we worked with an NGO called Tawasul, who their idea was to sort of introduce technical learning, basically teaching children a means of livelihood that they can use so that their parents would allow them to attend the school, basically to not cut their income as they would probably be doing different jobs and learn at the same time. So it's a very, very dense neighborhood. As you can see, a lot of the buildings are not finished. And the land is very, very expensive. So we had a small plot of land and we wanted to get the maximum out of it. There are no playgrounds in the area, no parks, no public spaces. So the school had to function sort of as a community center, as a school, and also as sort of a training center for the children. So what we did was to make the most out of the site. Basically, people build up to the edge of the property in areas like that. So you have very little control over the facades of a building. The only areas that you have control over are the ones overlooking the streets. So what we did was we took sort of the longest dimension of the site, which would be the diagonal, and pulled the building in. Instead of making a courtyard, for example, we pulled the building in this Z form, basically, so that all our facades were within the property lines that we could control. So this would allow us basically to have openings, to have natural light and ventilation through the building while making the most use out of the site. So we raised the building on columns basically to give the whole or the most of the ground floor to the playground, which was really needed, as well as another area that was a theater right on the street, which is this area right here, and a canteen, a cafeteria. So basically all the functions happening on the ground floor were public functions. The theater, a lot of performances happen in the theater there for the community. The playground is used all day and even after school hours. And the kitchen also serves meals and for people in the area as well. These are some images of the neighborhood. You can see the school there in sort of, this is a typical, a typical poor neighborhood in Egypt. So it's very common for people in these neighborhoods to use very bright colors in the areas that they can control. Basically, you will find that the balconies are always very bright, decorated. So we borrowed from that language basically in the building, in the facade, using various colors sort of to relate to that. The images at the bottom there, you can see the various functions. There's the theater. I'm sorry, I don't have larger pictures, but you can see here the theater. There's a sort of a circus or a gymnasium for performing arts, and the canteen. Right next door is a plastic sorting plant that you can see in this image. I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth. The roof was also used sort of as a gardening space and a playground for the younger children. So basically to provide some much needed green area and playgrounds for children. So I think that's all I have for this project. But I just wanted to put them side by side because I think that they help highlight the idea that was brought in by Saif in the beginning regarding the style of the modernity, and then later on the traditional architecture of Hassan Fathi and Ramses Nosshi, and then sort of dealing with two very different contexts of an urban one and a natural one. And again, sort of trying to stay away from the idea of style and dealing with the actual elements of the context. And the more elements that you draw from the context, the more relevant the project becomes, basically being more inclusive in terms of the choice of materials, the choice of the layout itself, the culture of the people in the area. All of that sort of enriches and informs the project and helps it stay relevant from my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramses. I mean, I have a couple of questions for you before we open the floor to the audience.
Sure.
With respect to this project, I mean, what sorts of things did you think about heating and cooling, for example?
Okay.
How is this building designed in that respect?
The building was sort of we have it was raised above the ground basically to allow the air through, and we have two courtyards because formed by the mass of the building, so that helped air and light pass through the building. So there's very little need for electrical lighting and for air conditioning, except for the summer months when the building is not really used that much for as a school. It's used more as workshops. So mainly it was the natural lighting and ventilation that as well as the dealing with the facades. We sort of tried to shade the windows by building deep facades that were also. I'm sorry, I don't have very clear pictures for it, but basically you can see the windows are set deep in the walls so that they're shaded, and this depth was used as storage space for the classrooms as well. That's mainly the main concepts there. And
my other question, thanks, is what kinds of challenges do you face in trying to embed these ideas in your work? I mean, how easy or how difficult is it?
It's well, these two projects were with in the first project of Wadi Gemal was a competition. It was a design competition. So basically, the client needs were relayed in the beginning, and they liked the idea. So this wasn't difficult. The second project, of course, was much more difficult because you're not reinventing the wheel, but you're going against a lot of preset ideas. There's a model school basically that's given by the Ministry of Education, and this is the approved school. So when we propose something different of an elevated building with a playground underneath, that that sort of met a lot of resistance, and also having a client that sort of believes in doing something that's appropriate and daring is very rare. They have to be convinced themselves sort of to accept the ideas that you're proposing.
Yeah, it's true. Often, I mean, you realize when you try to actually implement these projects, what an achievement it is when you get people to accept something that they normally would not think of.
Yeah.
Because often people have very set ideas about what things should look like and how they should function and what materials and what the design should be like.
That's very true.
The technical background. That's
very true. Like with the Wadi Gemal project, the national park, the people assume that you would build a mud building with domes and vaults, basically. But again, we made it a point sort of to challenge that concept.
Well, with respect to the first project, I mean, was there some surprise in your use of corrugated iron?
Yes, the corrugated iron was a compromise on my part. I wanted to use the same oil drums that were used in various houses in the area, sort of to show that it's a respectable way of building, and it's an ingenious way of building. And the problem with the way that they traditionally use it is it becomes excessively hot.
Mm-hmm.
So the way to avoid that was sort of to elevate the roof and separate it have a second roof underneath. So basically to use the steel for its properties of being waterproof and weatherproof and resilient, and avoid the negative parts of it being very hot. So having a second roof underneath, basically, and the layer that helped the air move actually works to create a draft, even if there isn't a breeze. Just a difference in temperature creates a draft, like in a drum wall, for example. it met a lot of resistance, but the merits of the corrugated metal were it can be reused, and when used appropriately, I think it fits the function.
But when it's used, such as the things that you showed us, where they're barrels of oil and drums and things that have been flattened, I mean, is the only reason they use it that it's available and that it's cheap? Okay.
Yeah, it's available, it's cheap, and it resists the rain. So basically, it keeps the house dry.
Also, well, what's the government's response to such things? I mean, are these ideas welcomed? And is it conceivable to think of government-sponsored projects using this kind of building technology and this approach to building technology? Or is it something that is hard to imagine, like the school, for example, or the visitor center? I mean, when you said that there was a model school, like a prototype that they say, okay, just do this one with a corridor and I know 2 staircases and classrooms in the middle. I mean,
right.
Do you think, I mean, to what extent do these kinds of projects actually enable the state authorities to think differently?
The school, for example, is the model school, the prototype that the government sets basically is a single classroom and a single loaded corridor overlooking the outside of the building. And what we proposed, so that we can have the building within the site and be able to have both facades open, was to have a double loaded corridor. So when you read the code, for example, this is sort of a boring answer, but when you read the code, it specifies the width of the corridor, and it specifies that any classroom basically has to have windows on either side.
Okay.
So that if you're writing, for example, you don't throw a shadow over the work surface. So we respected these dimensions and these specifications, but we did probably what they didn't expect of having another classroom on the other side of the corridor.
So you have windows onto the corridor.
We have windows onto the corridors to allow the air to pass through and to light the corridor as well.
Okay. There's a question here, which I'll read out to you. Are all the spaces in the Tawasul Community School used by boys and girls at the same time? So the person asking the question has capitalized the word all in all the spaces, and boys and girls. So, I mean, they're kind of 2 questions, but
it's a mixed school. I don't think that they don't separate boys and girls. I think the only separation is the bathrooms, basically the lavatories. All the other spaces are used by both boys and girls.
Okay, and are they all? I mean, are most of the spaces used? If you go to most spaces in the school, all the spaces in the school, is it the kind of school where everything's being used? I've been to the school; it's a wonderful place, and I know it has like a gymnasium upstairs and various spaces. I mean, is it the kind of thing that's very intensively used over the course of the day?
It's very intensively used, and especially the gymnasium and the theater. And it's open to people outside of the neighborhood as well. So they have a lot of performances in these 2 spaces, basically. And the entire building is utilized.
So it has a community dimension as well, I suppose.
It does, and they even sort of sacrificed a couple of the administration offices to build a clinic where visiting doctors would come for maternity, for drug rehabilitation, for various needs. So sort of like a hot desk, basically. It functions for various needs.
Well, I hope that answers the question. Do you have a follow-up, or does anyone else have other questions on that point or any other point? Well, one question about finding people that know how to build with these techniques like the rubble and the palm panel. I mean, how easy is it to find this kind of labor?
It's becoming more and more difficult, of course, because not that it doesn't exist, but because it exists, but it's not in demand. So basically, if you're a mason and you specialized in stone construction, there's the demand is sort of sporadic. You're not guaranteed project after project. So it's less attractive for younger generations sort of to learn these techniques.
So what do they do when they're not being commissioned by people like yourself?
They'll work in regular construction.
Oh, really? So they do both?
They do both. And the masons I work with basically were building hotels in the area. A lot of the hotels along the Red Sea will have, a spectacular dome in the lobby or something, and these masons will go build that part, and maybe if they're lucky, they'll get commissioned for a next one. So the fact that they worked with the stone for that project was, we were lucky to get them there. And we sort of tried to push these ideas in other projects so that we maintain a tie and they still feel that there's a relevance for their craft.
Mm-hmm. When someone is asking about the type of projects that you work on, saying, do you find that these new style projects have an influence on architects? Yes, I think I've since that project. I mean, it was a daring project because it was sort of a very unique project where you're in a spectacular setting, and it's everything was we were quite lucky to work on a project like that. And when you push sort of the norm and the preconceived ideas, people do notice these things, and people are attracted to different sort of ideas, and they do recognize it. And I think they recognize the difference and the fact that it's just as practical and it's just as relevant as traditional architecture. You mean traditional architecture that doesn't use any environmentally friendly materials?
I mean.
Okay. Okay. Well, Olivia, do you have any other comments on this point or anything else you want to ask? Or anyone else? How would the cost of building the visitor center in the way that you built it, how does it compare to not building in that way? Is it more expensive, the same, or less expensive?
It's more or less the same. The materials are not expensive, but the labor to work with the materials and the effort that you have to put to transport and work with these materials is expensive. I mean, it's a labor-intensive process. So whatever you save on the materials themselves, you do expend on the actual labor. But I think if you look at it as an economical model, then it's more or less the same. But if you bring in the life cycle of the building, the running cost of it, the maintenance, and then what you do with it once it's no longer in use. So basically, this building, you would demolish it and you'd be left with a pile of stones, basically, and reusable wood and reusable corrugated metal panels. Whereas if it was, for example, a concrete and glass construction, you basically would have very little that you can reuse. And it would cost a lot to get rid of the rubble as well.
So in the long run, it's actually much more economical.
I think so, yes.
Does anyone else have other questions or comments? And do you think that the traditional types of building, the birch that you showed us, is that likely to survive into the future, or is it something that, are we seeing the last generation of this type of building?
That's a tough question. Unfortunately, I think it's not very common anymore, and it's not very likely to survive. We try to integrate some of the elements sort of to keep it relevant, but of course it's one project in the middle of sort of a flood. So yeah, I think a lot of, for example, the woven mats that we saw are being replaced by new plastic ones.
And are these tribes do they still move around? You mentioned at the beginning that they go between Egypt and Sudan. Is this still the case, or are they?
It's still the case, but their life is much more complicated along the border now with all the tension that's happening in Sudan. And a lot of them have recently gotten into sort of illegal activities like gold mining in desert valleys, and lots of clashes happening these days because of that.
Oh wow!
Yeah, there's a gold rush in in this area.
But I thought that actually gold mining, you have to go through tons and tons and tons of material to find a small amount of gold.
That's true in the old quarries, but they're always discovering new valleys with veins of gold, and it's still very much a frontier, I think.
Okay, well, I just have one final question. Do you see that the demand for environmentally appropriate architecture is increasing in the kind of things you get commissioned to do, or is it becoming a more mainstream thing to think about these things? So, and there's a question actually, what are your current projects?
It's definitely increasing because of the high cost of living, basically, in terms of energy consumption and materials themselves. I'm currently working on very different projects. I'm working on a new magazine for storage facility, basically for some pharaonic blocks from a temple in Karnak. We're building a shelter there for demolished a demolished temple. So basically, we have like 16,000 blocks from a demolished temple by Akhenaten in Karnak, and they're housed at the moment in a asbestos building, a small building with an asbestos roof. So we're demolishing that building and rebuilding something else with mud brick and a steel roof to house these blocks. I have several residential projects where we're using domes and vaults as the structure for the buildings, for the villas, and so making a more contemporary space using traditional techniques.
And how big will your storage area for the temple blocks be? If 16,000 blocks is quite a huge number.
It's huge. It's huge. It's about 100 meters long and 8 meters wide.
Okay. Oh wow! So it's like long and long.
It's a long narrow storage in between two huge mud brick walls, basically.
And what are you building it out of?
Well, the outside is mud brick. Mm-hmm. And the roof will be a steel structure.
Okay. And how long do you think it will be finished?
I think we will start construction in September. So we're hoping 6 months, maybe.
Okay. Well, it sounds like an interesting project.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ramses. I think it was so interesting to have this comparison of two very different projects and to think. Well, I think actually the second one is also very thought-provoking, how you can deal with an environment that's so challenging and so dense and does not have the luxury of spending extra money on things, and come up with a building that responds to its urban context and also shows you that actually you can think about cooling and wind in a plot of land that most people would just think, oh, we're just going to build like everyone else.
Yeah.
And actually, it's a very uplifting school. I think it's so bright and I mean, just the environment of being there makes you feel cheerful and uplifted, which I think is a great success in itself.
Yeah, I think it's much needed in this area. The contrast and I think the NGO themselves, they have, they're very in tune with the community there.
You think that it might lead to other schools being built in this way?
I hope so. During the opening, we were approached by several other people who were interested in doing something similar.
Okay.
So I hope it does, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think that you embody very well the century of creative and inspired architects in Egypt trying to embed new ways of thinking, or sometimes old ways of thinking, but in contexts that wouldn't naturally think that way.
Thank you, Saif.
Thanks, and
it's a pleasure.
It's wonderful that you could join us. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.